Yesterday, we were thinking about this question of science. How can you believe in God in the face of scientific advancements? And we said, actually, science and faith are not enemies. They don't have to be competing with each other. In fact, it's quite possible to be an intellectually satisfied believer in God. But we also said that if you really want to look at the foundation to Christianity, then science is not really the discipline that's going to enable you to do that the best. We actually said because Christianity is centered on the person of Christ. Someone said if you take Christ out of Christian, you're left with three letters, I-A-N, and Ian can't help you. That's a cheesy joke that I won't use. But Christianity is about Christ, okay? Because it's about Christ, a historical person, the way to discover the foundation and investigate the foundation of Christianity is through historical methods. And of course, if we're going to look at the Bible, actually what we need to do is look at Jesus. We need to look at the Bible. Of course, there are sources for Jesus outside of the Bible. But if we really want to get our teeth into who Jesus was and stuff like that, we're going to need to look at the New Testament. Now, when we approach the question of the Bible, there's a couple of mistakes people often make, particularly in the West. Some people, perhaps fundamentalist Christians, make the mistake of saying, well, the Bible must be true just because it's the Bible, a kind of unthinking, unquestioning acceptance of it simply because it's a religious text. But the opposite mistake some people make is this. They say, well, the Bible mustn't be true simply because it's the Bible. A kind of unthinking, unquestioning rejection of the Bible just because it's a religious text. Both of them are mistakes, I would suggest. Actually, we want to say the Bible, like any other historical text, is a text, and we want to ask the question, as we would any other text, are there reasons for considering it to be historically reliable? That's what we're going to do today. The other thing is worth saying is that when we come to the Bible, some people might say, well, I don't believe the Bible is God's word, or how can you accept the Bible to be God's word? Now, as a Christian, I happen to believe the Bible is God's word, but actually I'm not seeking today to defend that, but rather in a lesser way, just to say, is the Bible historically reliable? Does it give us reliable information about Jesus? Of course, if it does, we might also find that it's more than that, and it is also God's word. But you don't need to come to that conclusion to start with, at least. Just look at it, first of all, as historical text. And the other thing to say is, obviously, we're not going to be able to look at the whole Bible today in 20 minutes. That's not to say that there aren't good reasons for trusting the historical reliability of, say, books in the Old Testament, like the prophet of Daniel or something like that. If you want to ask questions, you can later. I'd love to talk about it. But because, as we've said, Christianity hangs or falls on the person, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, it's the New Testament gospel accounts that we really want to focus on today and look at those. Now, really, when we come to something like the Gospels, there are two big questions. Of course, there might be others, and you might want to text them in later, but two big questions that I'd like us to think about. And the first is, how do we know that they haven't been changed? How do we know that what we have today is what was written back then? And then secondly, how do we know that what was written back then was what actually happened back then? How do we know that they weren't just made up, fabricated stories for the purposes of starting a new religious group or something like that? So those are the two questions we're going to look at. And let's start with this one. How do we know that it hasn't been changed? I don't know whether you've ever played the game Chinese Whispers. I'm not sure why suited businessmen are playing the game Chinese Whispers, but that's the picture that came up at the top of Google search when I searched for Chinese Whispers. But you've played the game perhaps, or I think the Americans call it telephone. But you get a group of people, you sit them in a big circle, and then someone whispers something into the ear of the next person, and it goes on round the circle very secretively, and until at the end of the circle, of course, whatever was said at the beginning has been twisted and distorted into something completely different to what was said at the beginning. And a lot of people say, isn't that what happens with the Bible and the Gospels? It's been passed on down the generations for 2,000 years, passed through different translations and different manuscript traditions, so that what we have today must be a very poor reflection of what was originally written back then. Now, if that was what happened, then you would have a point. But actually, if you think about the game of Chinese Whispers for a moment, imagine you have that circle of people. Imagine if you could go back round the circle to the second or the third person. You would have a much better understanding of what was originally said. And just imagine if rather than whispering it secretively in the ear of the next person only once, they actually said it to a whole group of people together so that they could hear. You see, when we come to the New Testament, we aren't looking at a book that's been just kind of passed on secretively down through the ages from one translation to another through different languages. But people have always sought to go back to the earliest copies available so that what we have today is the best and most reliable translation of the most closest and the earliest manuscripts. And so there are two questions you might want to ask then in regard to this. The first is, how long is the time gap between the date of writing? So between when the Gospels were written and our first manuscripts, how much time could there have been error that we can't check? And secondly, how many manuscripts have we got to deal with? Are we just putting all our eggs in one manuscript basket, as it were? Best illustration I give you of that, imagine if you were to go into a primary school and the teacher had written something on the board that everyone in the class had to write down. Now imagine if all you have is one copy of one child's work. You wouldn't really know, for instance, whether they've copied it down reliably, unless you could see the blackboard. But if you had all of the students' work and you could compare them together, although all of them might have mistakes, because you have a collection of copies, you could between them work out what was originally written. So these two questions are important. Now, if we apply those two questions to another work from antiquity, I pick it because it's written at about a similar time, between 60 and 70 AD, Josephus' Jewish War. You'll find that the oldest manuscript we have of that text is in the 5th century. And we've got 9 copies from around that time that we have to go on today. But along with other works from antiquity, people would generally regard that that's a reliable historical text. No problem with that. So what about the New Testament when we come to that? New Testament was written, well, of course, because it was a collection of 27 different books between roughly 50 and 90 AD. The oldest manuscript, or part of a manuscript, is actually pictured here, is dating from about 125 AD. It was discovered down in Egypt. If you want to see it, head up to Manchester to the John Rylands Library, and you'll see it's a fragment of John's Gospel. But a much shorter period of time, and in fact, if you're just looking at Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, there are 5,000 early manuscripts of all or part of the New Testament that we could be looking at. So actually you can see there, in comparison with other works from antiquity, the New Testament is not only comparable, but actually you might say has got even more going for it. If you want to put it in a picture, to explain what's going on here, the dot in the middle of the picture there, the black dot, represents the date of writing of all of these different works from people in antiquity. Obviously they weren't all written at the same time, but if you put them into one dot, the length of the line represents the length of time between the date of writing and our earliest manuscripts, and the size of the circle represents the number of manuscripts we're talking about when it comes to that particular work. The figure of 24,000, by the way, includes translations like Latin translations of the New Testament. That would be about 5,000 if it was just Greek. But you can see when you start to compare the New Testament text with other works of antiquity, it's not only similar, but actually in one sense you might say it's got an even stronger case, a much stronger case that could be made for it in that regard. So if you are therefore going to suggest that you could suggest other works of antiquity have been reliably passed on, why not do that with the New Testament? There are very good reasons for suggesting that actually it hasn't been changed throughout history because of the manuscript tradition we have. Now, what about this second question though? How do we know it wasn't just made up? Okay, you might say, the New Testament has been passed down reliably, but surely people could have just made up the stories to start a new religion. How do we know that what was written back then is actually what happened? Well, there's a number of things to bear in mind in this regard. Firstly, you want to ask the question, when was it written? There's very good reasons for believing that all of the Gospel accounts were written in the 1st century. We've seen a copy of a manuscript from the early 2nd century. But they were written in the 1st century at a time when the contemporaries of Jesus were still alive. Now that's really important. It's much more easy to fabricate a document 100 years after the event when the eyewitnesses are dead than it is at a time when the things that you're describing would have taken place, when the witnesses of those supposed events would still be alive to either back up or, in this regard, to disregard it. They were still alive. They were written either by eyewitnesses or by people who had access to the eyewitnesses. Secondly, you want to ask the question about their motive. Why did they write these things? It's a very interesting fact that for 300 years, at the start of the Christian church, Christians were persecuted by the state and by the authorities and the religious authorities of the day for their belief in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. It was only in the 4th century that Christianity gained any sense of political power or acceptance. Which means that for 300 years, believing this stuff that the early Christians believed had a great cost attached to it. The people who claimed these things, the gospel writers, faced great persecution and some of them physical death because of the things that they were that they were saying. Which kind of makes you ask the question, if they were making them up, why did they make them up? I mean, think about it. When I was a kid, I sometimes made up stories to get myself out of trouble, okay? You know, stories like, my sister did it, the dog ate it, it was on fire when I got here, those kind of stories, you know? We all make up stories to get ourselves out of trouble, but nobody in their right mind makes up a story to get themselves into trouble. So why did these gospel writers make up these stories that actually carried a great cost to themselves personally and the followers of them? So the question of motive is important. Thirdly, are there alternative explanations? Are there other people providing actually much more rational and reasonable explanations for this person, Jesus Christ? See, give you an example. You know, imagine if I was to make up a story about Anna, our host today, okay? And I was to, that got her listening, and I was to make up this story about Anna, and I said, you know, you think Anna is just a student at, which college are you at? So? Fitz, okay. So you think Anna is just a student at Fitz, but actually she is God incarnate. And I'm going to write down some incredible stories about Anna, and I'll say that, you know, she's been walking on water, you know, she's been walking down the Cam, not just punting on the Cam, but walking on the Cam. I bet a few other people wish they could do that when they fell off their punts. And the food that you all ate today, actually that was Anna's packed lunch. And she's just been standing there in the foyer breaking it in half many, many times, and so on. And I was to make up these stories, and then I got it published in the local paper. What's your local paper here in Cambridge? Well, in the varsity paper, okay? And I get it published and serialised. Now, the question is, firstly, do I stand a chance of getting it published? And secondly, is anyone going to believe it? I mean, some of you know Anna, and you might say, well, she's a lovely student, but she's not God, and she's not done those things. See, trying to make those kind of claims at a time when you're still alive are very hard. Now, remember, the gospel writers are making these claims about Jesus, these stupendous claims about Jesus, at a time when the eyewitnesses are still alive. Not just the friends of Jesus, but also the enemies, the opponents of Jesus are still alive. And yet there exists from the 1st century no alternative explanations for the miracles of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and so forth. No alternative explanations from that time. It seems that it wasn't so much that the people of Jesus' day couldn't believe that Jesus was God, although many of them wouldn't believe. But their reasons for that were not so much intellectual, but moral. There were no alternative explanations. Now, there are, of course, other gospels, you might say, inverted commas, Gnostic gospels, like the ones found at Nag Hammadi in the middle of last century. But they're written much later. They're not written by eyewitnesses. They come from the later centuries of the Christian church. So the lack of alternative explanations is another thing to bear in mind. Another thing you might want to ask is this: does it fit with history? If the gospel writers were making up these stories, and particularly if they were making them up at a later date in a different area, there were all sorts of ways in which they could have and would have very easily got the details wrong. And yet, as we check the New Testament by what we know of archaeology and the history of that time, we find again and again they pass the test. All sorts of things like the geography and the architecture. In John's Gospel, we're giving those away free this week. In chapter 5, we read a story about a guy who was healed by a pool called Bethesda. And John adds the little detail that this pool had 5 covered colonnades. And a lot of people 200 years ago said, oh, John clearly didn't know anything about the architecture of places in Jerusalem, and there is no pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, and we've looked. Until, of course, they found it, which is rather awkward for the people who said it didn't exist. And they found, not very clearly shown, but in other photos you could see it fits exactly with John's description of it. So you see all sorts of things that fit. There's a guy called Richard Borkham that wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I'd recommend it. It's a bit of a read. But he says actually there are all sorts of ways we can test the New Testament. For instance, the names. If you were making up a story that happens even today, how would you get the popularity of names right to fit with the popularity of names in society? But he says, look, if you check the popularity of names in the first century, and he's done studies on that, with the popularity of names in the Gospels and the book of Acts, remarkably it fits. Try and do that with something like the Gnostic Gospels, they don't get it anywhere near correct. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it necessarily has to be true, but it's another indicator. There are all sorts of ways in which they could have and would have very easily got things wrong, and yet they didn't. Now, a lot of people say, well, the gospel writers were just, unintelligent people who just kind of made up a story. Well, the one thing we can't say of them is that. At the very least, we have to say they're very highly intelligent people to have got these details right. Now, it's worth saying, you cannot, and it would be wrong of me to suggest you could, take every claim of the Bible and find external manuscript or archaeological evidence to back it up. Okay? It'd be a bit weird if you could find archaeological evidence to back up something like the virgin birth, for instance. But wherever we can test the New Testament's texts by other sources, by other texts, and by archaeology, we find again and again that it fits, that it's backed up. Which leads us to think, what would be the better assumption to make? If where we can check it, it shows itself to be reliable, should we assume that where we can't check it, it isn't reliable? Or maybe that where we can't check it, perhaps it might also be reliable there too. And here's one last thing to say, and that's, if not, then what? What do I mean by that? You see, often a lot of people say, well, I don't believe this stuff about Jesus. But we're going to say, if you don't, what is your alternative explanation? What's your alternative explanation for this incredible teaching that is still so much part of our language today? Who was the person responsible for it, if not Jesus? And what event was responsible for transforming the worldview of strict monotheistic Jews in the first century so that they would believe that a human being who had died at the hands of the Romans, their hated enemies, was in fact God? And what was it that sparked off the biggest sociological phenomenon in history 2,000 years ago? Don't just say, well, it wasn't. What was it instead, if it wasn't this? See, what I want to say is there are good reasons for not only thinking that the New Testament and the Gospels have been reliably passed on, but actually they record what actually happens. Now, given what I've just said, some of you are sitting there saying, oh, this is fascinating, and I've got 100 questions. We'll come to those in a minute. But I'm guessing, on a talk like this particularly, some of you are saying, man, I'm not into history, and this is completely boring. And maybe you've kind of just zoned out in what I've just been saying. And I have to confess, although I think this is important, for some people this does come across as rather boring. But why is it important? Well, let me try and illustrate. When I travel around Europe quite a lot, and when I go on a plane, provided you're not going with Ryanair where it's like cattle class, but if you go with like a normal airline, they actually give you the option of sitting by the window or sitting by the aisle, don't they? Unless you're really late, and then you get stuck between two sumo wrestlers with no arm room whatsoever. But if they ask me that question, I always have to opt for the window. Window seat is definitely the way to go. There are two reasons why I always opt to sit by the window when I'm flying. The first is that I don't have to be clambered over by the incontinent person to my left whenever they want to go to the toilet. But also, I love windows. Don't you? I mean, have you ever thought on the plane how beautiful those windows are? They are so aesthetically pleasing. They are, in fact, I think, triple glazed, which I find really fascinating. I could spend hours looking at a window. Well, actually, no, that's absolutely rubbish, isn't it? No one looks at a window. You look through a window. The purpose for sitting by a window is so you can see what's on the other side. Now, if the window is broken or damaged or shut, you won't be able to see through it. But the purpose of a window is not to look at it, but to look through it. And really, the reason why we get hung up about the Bible is because actually the purpose of the Bible is not simply to look at it, to ask these questions, they're important, or even to simply study it as a text, but to look, as it were, through it at what it represents. And what we want to say is that, what we believe is that the Bible is like a window that shows us God and what God is like. That as we look through the Bible, we see God revealing himself, and most clearly and importantly in the person of Jesus Christ. So looking at it and asking these questions of reliability are important, but looking at Jesus himself through the text is the most important thing of all. And actually, when you do that, you might find that you get surprised. Because the figure that you find walking off the pages of the New Testament blows our presuppositions about God out of the water. He's so different. In fact, I want to say so much better than the God that we so often invent or imagine. And so that's what we'd encourage you to do, to have a look at it. Now, I'm going to invite up, before we have questions, Charlotte. Charlotte, come and join me on the stage, because I want to ask Charlotte a couple of questions that will kind of personalise this maybe for some of us. Charlotte, firstly, if we dare, tell us, where did you study?
I went to Oxford.
Okay, moving quickly on. So you went to Oxford University, but you're here helping out with the week. We've been very gracious and allowed you to come.
Yes.
Yeah. But when you went as a student to Oxford, what was your attitude towards the Christian faith?
So I went up to Oxford, frankly being pretty offended by Christianity. I felt like the God of the Bible wanted to tell me that I wasn't good enough, and that was pretty annoying because I was trying really hard. I mean, I wasn't perfect, but I was working the best that I could, and I didn't feel like it was good enough for God.
Okay, so you kind of didn't like it, and you didn't think it was true either. What happened to change that?
So I went to a week of talks exactly like this, and they were speaking from the Gospels. Now I decided, because I didn't like what God had to say, Jesus probably wasn't real. But then I listened to the talks, and there was actual historical credibility to these accounts. There were eyewitnesses to what Jesus said and did. And that was pretty awkward for me, because it meant that I had to confront Jesus as a real person. I couldn't pretend that he was just a fairy tale.
So you discovered there was some truth in this, but then you actually started reading the Bible for itself, didn't you? And you found that was surprising as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so at this point in the week I was pretty annoyed, but I kept going to the talks, and they spoke from Luke's Gospel. There's a story called The Prodigal Son that Jesus tells. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but basically there's this lovely father, and he's got this son, and the son's like, I wish you were dead. I wish I had my inheritance already. Give me the money. I'm off. And he leaves him. And the son makes a mess of his life, and then comes back with his tail between his legs saying, oh, please take me back. And the father, without a moment's hesitation, just welcomes him home. And I didn't expect to read that in the Bible. That wasn't what I thought the Bible was going to tell me. I recognized myself in the son who had said, yeah, I'll have the stuff, God, but I don't want anything to do with you. You can shove off. And I saw the character of God in the father, who is gracious and forgiving and just longing for his children to come home. And yeah, everything changed in that instant. I wanted to say sorry to God for rejecting him. And that night I prayed for Jesus to come and be Lord of my life. And here I am before you, a Christian, 10 years later.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Give her a round of applause. You can ask us some questions about it later if you want to hear more. But Charlotte came to that discovery. This isn't just true, but it's also wonderful. And that's our hope, that you'll investigate. One final illustration. Imagine if you were walking along this afternoon and you came across on the pavements one of these, a scratch card. And you look down and you pick it up and it hasn't been scratched. And then you look around and you see if anyone's dropped it and you can't see anyone around, so you pick it up. What would you do? You'd scratch it, wouldn't you? But if you, I would anyway, I don't know about you. Now, what's the chance that that scratch card is going to be a winner with £100,000? Well, probably pretty minimal, hey? But you'll still give it a scratch, because there might be a chance. In fact, there is a chance that it could be. Now, you might be sitting here saying, look, I'm not convinced by what you've said, but I'm saying, look, if there was a chance that this was true, that the claims that the New Testament makes about Jesus Christ are true, wouldn't it be worth having, as it were, a scratch and a see? Wouldn't it be worth investigating for yourself? So I'd really encourage you to do that. 3 ways that you could do that. Firstly, there are some books as you leave, and we'd love you to take those away. They're free if you're here investigating this for yourself. Why not take one? This book called Why Trust the Bible, particularly relevant on today's talk, written by a lady who's done a lot of work in it, Amy or Ewing, and that would be a really helpful book that might answer some more of your questions on this. Also, this book, which is actually on the back of the pew, hopefully, in front of you, this is, I mentioned this earlier, John's account of the life of Jesus, written by one of the eyewitnesses. As well as reading about the Bible, one of the best things to do would be to read one of the accounts within the Bible of the life of Jesus. If you're here and you're saying, well, look, I'm an atheist, I don't believe all this stuff, let me encourage you to read it, at least for the sake of intellectual credibility. At the end of reading that, at the very least that you'll be able to say is, well, at least I've now checked it out, and I know it's a load of rubbish, but I warn you, you may not come to that conclusion. It's a dangerous book to read.